The EOS R5C is a major new cinema camera from Canon, and as you'd expect, there are a ton of great reviews about it online from all the usual suspects. But there are a few points about the camera I had trouble figuring out before buying it, and since I've been using it for about 8 months now, I thought I'd share those here for the benefit of anyone else looking at the camera. One of the most startling features about this camera is its split personalities, having completely different operating systems for video and photo mode. Since my main interest is video, that's what I'll be looking at here. So to be clear, this isn't going to be a comprehensive review, just a roundup of some of the technical aspects of the camera that seem to be hard to find online. So I'll be talking about the various bit rates the camera records at, the codecs it supports and how they compare, memory cards and speeds, battery life and USB powering, and remote control. And bear in mind that this is going to be about video. Of course, I've shot some stills with the camera and as you'd expect, it's awesome. But video is my main use case, so that's what I'll be talking about here. So while I'm here, I'll just give you some quick impressions I have of the camera. Now, this might help you if you're on the fence about buying this camera. Overall, the camera feels fantastic. It's still a little bulkier than a regular mirrorless camera, but it's amazingly small and compact for what it does. And it feels really good in the hand, and I have big hands. The grip is nice and deep and gives you a good secure feeling hold on the camera, even with a larger lens attached. A bigger camera might have more to hold on to, but then it would be a bigger camera. You can always add the external battery grip if you want more hand room. The bottom of the camera has plenty of room for a tripod plate without blocking the battery door. I've got this Kirk Photo Arca Swiss plate on there, and it stays on very securely and doesn't twist thanks to 2 locating pins, so it just stays there. The controls are all great with a nice positive clicky feel to them. The fit and finish is superb. Of course, all of the button and dial assignments are customizable. There's a small reflective LCD on top which shows you your aperture, shutter speed, white balance and ISO, so those are always available. The menus are great and will be very familiar to users of Canon's newer cinema cameras, which means they're completely different to the menus in photo style cameras like the R5 and in fact the R5C's own photo mode. There are a lot of things to hunt through, but that's not really a fault. There are so many things that are customizable, and they generally have sensible defaults. On the whole, the menus are well organized. The camera's boot up time is fantastic. As you can see, from power on to recording, it's pretty swift. The only niggle is that it's easy to push the power switch from video to off and then through to photo mode, and then you have to wait for it to catch up. But you get used to operating the power dial with finger and thumb to avoid that. Of course, in a camera this small, it's no surprise that there are no built-in ND filters. I use a clip-on variable ND, which is a little bit of a hassle, but it works fine. The R5C does have focus peaking, zebras, waveform, vector scope, false colour, anamorphic D-squeeze, a focus guide, D-log for the display, markers including configurable aspect markers and more. The picture is paramount of course, and the R5C does really well because it produces a lovely image. It can shoot in all the main frame rates including a true 24.00. It shoots in Canon Log 3. Log 2 is missing, but that's not too big a problem. The 8K sensor produces plenty of detail if that's an issue, and one really nice feature is the built-in high-quality downsampling from 8K to 4K, so you can get almost all of the benefits of the 8K sensor without the enormous file sizes. One of the most striking features about the camera is its 2 separate modes for photo and video. The power switch rotates left to get into photo mode and right for video with off in between. In photo mode you have a true photo camera with all of the features you'd expect there, but in video mode it becomes a cinema camera with your shutter angle and waveform and vector scope and all those kinds of features. There are a few odd quirks. If I look at the capacity of my memory card in video mode it says 512 GB, but in photo mode it tells me 476 GB. Of course, the card's capacity is actually the same, but photo mode measures it in GIB, or gigabytes, which is 1.074 billion bytes. even though it says GB, which is clearly a billion bytes. So if you see the capacities of your memory cards varying weirdly, this could be why. The main connections are all via ports on the left side of the camera, all of which have rubbery covers over them. There are 3.5mm jacks for mic and headphones, a USB-C and a micro HDMI. This is not the best for durability, but there it is. There's also a coaxial flash sync connector and a 1.0/2.3 timecode connector. On the front there's a 3-pin remote control connector. On the top, the hot shoe has the usual flash controls, plus it's a multifunction connector which takes a range of accessories. The camera has 2 card slots, one SD and one CF Express Type B. You can just use one of these depending on what mode you're shooting. For example, if you're shooting 4K IPB, an SD card would be fine. I'll show you in a bit which cards work with which modes. And you can use both slots. Although not symmetrical, as the cards will have very different capabilities, you have a number of options for how to use them. You can do relay recording, where when one card fills up, it seamlessly continues on the other card. You can open the card door to swap out a full card while recording. Of course, this only works if the video mode you're recording is supported by both cards. You can also do double slot recording. Or you can do sub-recording, which is the same thing, but the second card uses a lower bitrate mode. And you can use the second slot for proxy recording, or for recording audio. For people who've seen the R5, a little comparison might be useful. It might seem that the R5C is a straightforward upgrade over the R5, but it's not quite that simple. So let's take a closer look. From an external point of view, the R5C is basically identical to the R5 with a few exceptions. The most obvious is that it's deeper to allow for the active cooling. Basically, the display is bulged out backwards, which incidentally makes it way easier to fold the display out, and the display articulates fully even with HDMI plugged in. There's a tally light like on the C70. This isn't too bright for outdoors use, but it's better than nothing. And that's about it for the hardware. It has the same image sensor, card slots and controls, except that the buttons now all have secondary markings for video mode. These are generally the same function, but named as they are on the C70. For example, the playback button is now also labelled media. The big differences are internal. The two huge ones, of course, are that the 30-minute record time limit is gone, and the active cooling means that overheating is just no longer an issue. And the dedicated video operating system is great, with its false colour and shutter angle and so on. The R5C can now shoot 8K RAW at 60 frames per second, though not on the internal battery. It shoots 10-bit in all modes, not just in log mode as on the R5, and it has dual base ISO, 800 and 3200. The R5 though does still have some advantages. Of course it's smaller, and not by a huge amount, but it does make a difference when you're packing the camera into a bag. The R5 has no fan, so no fan noise, and it has IBIS, which can be useful. And the R5 has significantly better battery life. It can record an hour and 45 minutes of 4K HQ, as opposed to just over an hour on the R5C. And if you're shooting pieces to camera, like I'm doing right now, then the R5 is a no-brainer, because it has great remote control in video mode. Here I've got my phone on a tripod, so I can check my focus and framing and so on as I go. With the R5C, there's no remote control in video mode, at least not without a big, expensive accessory. Still, these days I mostly use the R5C when I'm shooting video, because the video-centric operating system just makes it nicer to use. I gave the camera a quick test for low-light shooting to see what the R5C could do here. These tests were all lit by the light of one candle. They were deliberately shot dark and orange, as it's supposed to look like candlelight, but I wanted to see if I could at least get a usable image out of the camera while shooting in very low light, in the style of shows like Wolf Hall. It seems to me that the R5C did really well. There's certainly noise there, but bear in mind that these samples have had no denoising applied at all. As you push the ISO above 3200, the image holds together remarkably well. At 6400 it looks fine to me. It's only at 12,800 that the noise becomes really visible, and even then I wouldn't describe it as intrusive. and a smooth target test like this accentuates the noise. In a live action shoot, and again with noise reduction applied in post, this could be great. Power consumption and overheating have been hot topics on the Canon mirrorless cameras, and I've got to say that's no surprise to me. The amount of technology they're cramming into these tiny bodies is honestly amazing. Anyway, I ran some basic tests for battery life and heat performance, so let's take a look at the results. The battery in the R5C is pretty small. It's an LPE6NH, which is like the LPE6 but with a higher output rate. It claims a 2130 mAh capacity. It can feel like this battery isn't really up to the job of running this camera. The battery life isn't great, and there are some modes that just don't work on the internal battery. You can't shoot 8K RAW over 30 frames per second because it can't power the lens. Literally, the lens won't focus or change aperture. The camera does warn you about this, and there's a built-in power source navigation feature which lets you plan which modes work with which power sources and lenses, which is all good, but it still feels like they should have worked in a larger battery. But of course that would have made for a bigger camera. By the way, 8K IPB is fine on the internal battery. And in terms of comparing to the R5 doesn't shoot over 30 frames per second in 8K at all. So the R5C is clearly a step up here. So for battery life, I tested the camera shooting the TV, so there was some motion to handle, and with the LCD on, shooting 4K IPB continuously. In this mode, I got 1 hour and 7 minutes of runtime. In 8K IPB, I got 53 minutes. In 8K RAW ST, I also got 53 minutes. Higher frame rates cost more. 4K at 59.94 frames per second gave me 43 minutes, and 120 frames per second was about the same. You can power the camera over the USB connection, as long as you have a USB PD, power delivery, power supply and cable. But given that, you can easily charge the battery in the camera over the USB-C connection, either from a mains adapter or an external battery bank. You can also run the camera over USB power, but note that you absolutely need to have a battery in the camera. If there isn't one there, the camera will be completely dead, even though you're planning to power over USB. The LCD display on the camera shows USB PD instead of the battery gauge when it's working. I tested all this while shooting continuous 4K off the TV. Running off an external USB power bank with a rated 19,000 mAh capacity, I got 6 hours of runtime, with the power bank just about out. I couldn't test this in 8K because I don't have a memory card that can go that long. Overheating was a big controversy with the R5. One of the major features of the R5C is active cooling, which is supposed to fix the issue. So does it? Yes. The R5C has a fan, which is pretty quiet, but you can make it even quieter by setting it to automatic. In this mode, the fan stays on while you're in standby, but goes off when you press record, at least until the camera warms up. Then the fan will automatically kick back on. So the question with the R5C is, how long can you record for before the fan comes on? I ran the R5C continuously for 6 hours, recording 4K oversampled off my TV in a pretty warm living room, and the fan didn't come on. I finally gave up and went to bed. In 8K, shooting IPB, the fan came on after 2 hours and 5 minutes. In 8K RAW, I only ran a 1 hour battery test, but the fan didn't come on. So the bottom line is, I think the overheating issue is solved. The R5C supports a pretty complex set of frame rates and codecs, but actually if you work your way through the menus, it's not too hard to get set up. There are a few odd wrinkles though, so let's take a look at the process. So working your way down the menu, here's how you can select the mode you want. First, you can pick full frame, Super 35 or Super 16 crop mode. I haven't looked at the crop modes, which are of course 4K and 2K at best, not oversampled. I guess if you want that, it's there. Then you've got your system frequency, 59.94 NTSC, 50 PAL and 24.00. The system frequency determines the frame rates you get, which works pretty much as you would expect. Changing the system frequency basically reboots the camera, but that only takes a few seconds, and you won't be doing this very often. Then pick your main rec format, which is basically what codec you want. In full frame mode you have these options. For RAW you have the ST and LT variants. ST is less compressed, about 6.4:1, whereas LT is about 10:1. Shooting 8K at 59.94 is only available in RAW LT and requires an external power source. Note that all the frame rates over 59.94 are only available in slow and fast mode, which means no audio. Next you have the following chroma subsampling options and bit depths. For 422 10-bit, which I would guess is what most non-RAW people would shoot, you've got XF AVC, where AVC means H.264, and MP4 HEVC, which is H.265. Once you've set those, then you choose your resolution, which in turn controls your bitrate. In non-RAW modes you have these choices. In the RAW modes you have a different set of resolutions available, which are determined by your chosen crop factor. In the XF AVC H.264 modes you have the choice between long GOP and all intra recording, but limited to 4K resolution. In the MP4 H.265 modes it's long GOP only, but up to 8K. This means there's no 8K all-I. H.265 8K is limited to less than 30 frames per second. To get 50 or 59.94 you have to shoot 4K or lower, or shoot 8K RAW. Resolution, or detail, is by no means everything in picture quality, but it is a thing, and some people will be tempted by the 8K resolution of the R5C. But be careful here. Remember that camera resolutions are quoted in photosites, not pixels. Even though the video reads out in pixels, those are interpolated pixels. The actual resolution of an 8K camera is more like 5 or 6K pixels. Generally this means that you would shoot 8K to get the best resolution and then downscale in post, which means you're dealing with huge files. But the R5C has a trick. It can do the high quality downscaling, or what they call oversampling, in camera. So you can shoot 4K with oversampling and get most of the resolution benefit of the 8K sensor, but with files that are a quarter of the size. However, this downsampling doesn't happen in all modes, and even then, how close is it to real 8K? So I ran a bunch of tests to find out. I shot a chart with consistent framing, then placed the resulting videos onto a 4K timeline and made my best guess as to the final resolution. So what I'm testing is how good the resolution is in the various shooting modes when your delivery format is 4K. If you're delivering 8K, then you would presumably just shoot 8K. I've also shown numbers for the 8K modes when put on an 8K timeline. The results are summarised here. Bear in mind that the resolution numbers don't mean anything except for comparison, and they are just my guess, so there's some random variation. But still, I think there are some interesting results here. In the 4K modes, rates up to 30 frames per second give the best results. There's a noticeable drop-off in resolution when you go to 59.94 FPS. Slow and fast at 120 FPS is significantly worse again. No surprise really, 120 frames per second is a colossal amount of data, so it's no wonder the camera does a cheesy job of downscaling the sensor to 4K. I'm actually glad that it doesn't crop in those modes, as many cameras do. For the 8K modes, which includes RAW, RAW itself gives consistently good results, even at the higher frame rates. But the big surprise is MP4 8K, which on a 4K timeline was clearly the best of all. This, however, is due to how Premiere Pro downscales the 8K footage to a 4K timeline, which in the case of RAW seems to introduce some strong colour moire. If you look at the clips on an 8K timeline, the RAW has the better detail, as you'd expect. So if you're working on a 4K timeline from RAW 8K footage, be careful how you process it, or just shoot MP4 8K, which gives great results. One thing that can be tricky to figure out in advance is the exact bit rates the camera records at, and there really are a crazy number of possibilities. So to help you out, here's a summary table. I'm not going to go through all the modes because there really are too many, but to get started, here's a look at the non-crop recording modes in 12-bit RAW and 10-bit 422 in normal recording mode. I'll get to these slow and fast modes in a bit. The bit rates in normal recording just depend on your choice of codec and frame rate. In the cooked modes, it's down to whether your frame rate is above or below 30. The RAW modes are more complex because they change for every frame rate. For each codec, I've shown the bitrate in megabits per second, which is how camera rates are usually discussed, and megabytes per second, which is how memory cards are rated, and gigabytes per hour, which shows how fast you'll use up storage. There's some random plus and minus due to the variable compressibility of video, but pretty minor. For example, in XFAVC All Intra, at the lower frame rates, you'll be chewing through 185 gigabytes per hour. Personally, I usually shoot MP4 long GOP, which gives me 3 times as much footage on a card. In RAW modes, the bitrate varies with the frame rate, as the compression ratio stays about the same, about 6.4 to 1 for RAW ST and 10 to 1 for RAW LT. In the non-RAW modes, the bitrates are much simpler and the compression rate varies a little. The last column shows what type of memory card you need for each mode based on the data rate. The camera doesn't seem to enforce the need for a V90 card for MP4 8K, but it does complain if you try to use a non-V rated card, and it does insist on a CF Express card for the faster modes. As for which CF Express cards, well, there really isn't a speed rating system for CF Express. The VPG system seems to be semi-defunct, and actual recording speeds can vary wildly and are not printed on the card, so you're kind of on your own. I did find an article by Canon Canada which covers compatible cards for the R5C, and the link is on the screen and in the description. If you want to know more about the real-life speeds of memory cards, I have a video on that too. The slow and fast mode lets you set your target frame rate as normal, like 24 frames per second for example, but then have the camera shoot at a higher frame rate, so that when your footage plays back at the target frame rate, it's slowed down. In the menus, the camera displays the playback bitrate for whatever slow and fast mode you're in. The record bitrate is that number multiplied by the slowdown factor. This is the amount of data physically written to the memory card while recording. So this tells you what kind of card you need. There are a lot of combinations of frame rates. There are well over 20 different speeds you can shoot at. RAW ST only goes up to 30 frames per second, but RAW LT can do 60. XFAVC and MP4 go up to 120 frames per second. MP4 8K only goes up to 24, so I haven't bothered with it. So let's look at a representative sample of some of the bit rates you might see based on shooting at 60 and 120 frames per second and targeting a 24 frames per second timeline. As you can see, the slowdown factor is straightforward and is just your final frame rate divided by your shooting frame rate. So on a 24 frames per second timeline, shooting at 60 frames per second gives you a slowdown of 2.5 times, and shooting at 120, 5 times. I've also shown RAW ST at 30 frames per second, which is as high as RAW ST goes, but the slowdown is only 1.25 times on a 24 frames per second timeline, which isn't great. 5 times slow-mo is basically as good as you can get with this camera unless you use motion interpolation in post. Bear in mind too that the higher frame rates lose you some resolution, as I've already described. The playback bitrate is generally what you usually get in a given mode, and this is the number that the camera displays. The record bitrate is that number times the slowdown factor. This is important as it determines what kind of memory card you need and how fast it will fill up. In RAW, at 60 frames per second, the record bitrate can push 2.6 gigabits per second, which will chew through your storage at well over a terabyte per hour. But you can shoot the same frame rate in MP4 4K at just 338 megabits per second, which will use just 153 gigabytes per hour. As usual, I've shown the theoretical cards type you need for each mode. Some of the modes should work with an SD card, but when it comes to the fastest modes, for safety I would use CF Express for these. So the camera obviously has the two main modes, photo and video, and you can't record video in photo mode. But you can shoot still photos in video mode, albeit fairly basic JPEG only stills. This is potentially quite handy for things like production reference stills or social media posts, that kind of thing. The details are in the manual, but basically when in video mode, assign a button to photo and that becomes your shutter button. The big restriction is that it only saves stills to the SD card, so no SD card, no stills. If you only have a CF card, you just get a little red icon flashing up on the screen very briefly. But anyway, once you get past all that, it's easy. The camera takes plain JPEG images only, and it uses the same resolution you're shooting video in, which in 8K is over 35 megapixels, so not too bad. One thing to watch is that if you're shooting movies in log, then your stills will also be log, which is okay. You can apply a LUT in Photoshop or as a GIMP or even your video editor. Actually being able to shoot stills with exactly the same settings you're using for movies can be very useful for reference. You can preview your stills on the camera just like you would preview your movies, but you need to make sure that you have the right card slot and media type selected. Obviously for serious photo shooting you would just flip the camera into photo mode, which after all only takes a few seconds. But for grabbing a quick reference image or a social media post, that kind of thing, this feature could be pretty useful. The R5C is about as close as you can get to a real cinema camera without built-in ND filters. Its cinema camera operating system has all the features you need, from shutter angle to false color, and the camera creates a beautiful image with great colors, log3 and superb resolution. There are no compromises on recording time, except for battery life, which you can easily supplement with USB power. But the camera has no heat issues at all, and there are no artificial record time limits. There are some downsides to the R5C, but not a lot. The battery life could be better, but it's still better than some of the competition. The big downside for me is the lack of remote control in video mode, particularly since it has such great remote control in photo mode using the built-in Wi-Fi. But overall, the R5C is a great package for video shooters in an amazingly compact form factor. In any case, I hope this video has helped you to understand it a bit, and thanks for watching.